Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the symposium Climate Change and Ethics. Where are we? My name is Elizabeth Hild. I'm a professor of philosophy and the director of the Center for the Study of Ethics in the Professions at the Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago. Together with Kelly Laws, the librarian and researcher at the Ethics Center, we have organized this symposium. We think it's important to have a conference that reflects on the ethical assumptions implicit in discussions and actions around climate change. For in spite of the fact that everyone certainly agrees that concepts like justice, solidarity, and sustainability are very important for climate change mitigation and adaptation, progress so far has been very slow, unfortunately. With this symposium, we seek to engage all kinds of stakeholders in a debate around climate change and ethics. This is a two-day event on Friday and Saturday. We'll have three invited speakers: Stephen Gardner from the University of Washington, Kirsten Jenkins from the University of Edinburgh, and Renier Ibana from Ateneo de Manila University. In addition, we have great sessions, each with a number of presentations. Following the call of abstracts, we received a lot of great submissions, which made it very difficult for us to choose the presentations for the conference. That's why we decided to hold two additional webinars in April. You'll get some more information on this soon. But now let's begin with the first day of the symposium. You can see that we are a very international and interdisciplinary group, which is fantastic. I'm very much looking forward to 2 days of lively discussions now. But before we begin with the first session, which is role of ethics in the climate change debate, Kelly Laws will give you some more details.
So our first session is entitled The Role of Ethics in the Climate Change Debate. And our first speaker is Anna Peterson from the University of Florida. Her talk is titled Values, Practices, and Consequences. So Anna, if you'd like to unmute yourself and put on your video, you're welcome to begin.
Hi, thanks everyone. I was really excited when I saw the call for papers for this conference because it, even just the call itself got me very excited about some things I've been teaching. I am teaching a class right now on environmental values and practices, which is the second time I've taught it. And a lot of the things I've been thinking about in that class are making their way into this paper. So I don't have a PowerPoint or anything, and I'll try to be 10:06. I'll keep it to the 10 minutes, and if I talk too fast or skip things, then we can hopefully talk about them in the questions. So I start with a question from the call for papers, which says, how can abstract principles like justice, responsibility, and sustainability be materialized? And I think that this is a really important question, but I wanted to go sort of step behind this question a little bit and ask a few questions about the assumptions behind asking the question. So first off, I would say the sort of passive tense, be materialized, avoids the question of who's going to do that. Obviously, it's human beings. So we might say, how can people apply or materialize or embody abstract principles like justice, sustainability, etc.? And then where? In their everyday lives, in structures. So there are, I think most of us would say both in our everyday lives and in structures. In other words, I think that this is at heart a question about how can we live collectively and individually in more just, sustainable, and responsible ways. And this is obviously a question at the heart of our interest in climate ethics and in this conference. It's very urgent, but it's also an old question. And I'm not a philosopher, I'm a religion scholar, but there's many of you probably are philosophers and know more about this than I do, but I think about the Greek term akrasia, which is the kind of is a way to talk about this gap between what people think they should do and what they actually do. And for Plato, of course, acrasia would be addressed by more knowledge and better education. And this is still a very common approach among many philosophers, many, I think, environmental educators, policymakers. Social scientists refer to this as the knowledge deficit approach, right? Just more knowledge and people will then live according to their principles. However, I think it's become evident that that is not actually the case. And then there's also, there are also religious answers to this question, which focus on identifying the problem not as lack of knowledge, but as human moral weakness. And we have many versions of this. And in the letters to the Romans, Paul says, I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I do, right? This paradox that we know something we should do, but we don't do it. And for Paul and many religious traditions, the answer is that humans alone cannot do this. They cannot close this gap by themselves. They need something else. And so I think both knowledge and possibly divine intervention might be helpful, but I don't think either of them are really complete answers to the climate crisis or to this question of how can we live in more just and sustainable ways. But even more than that, stepping back from thinking about specific answers to this question, I want to ask whether or not this is even the right question for us to be asking. And by that, what I mean is that when we focus on the gap between our values and our practices, or even the very notion that there is such a gap, we are assuming some things that I think might not be true, or at least not completely accurate. So first and foremost, the problem is that, or there's an assumption that people deliberately adopt a set of values, right? They hold a set of principles, and then they embody them or materialize them or somehow apply or translate them into action. And I think that this approach, this assumption of a linear relationship between ideas and actions is itself a problem, okay? And what I mean is and so I want to focus on, there's a lot in that and we don't have too much time. So I want to focus on two particular aspects of why this is problematic. The first is that is the focus on individuals, and that the most important aspects of social change are individual attitudes, behaviors, and choices. And the second, and maybe more important one, is that there exists this linear relationship between ideas and actions. So I'm going to talk about each of those two pieces a little bit. So on the problem of individualization, most thinking about acrasia, about the value action gap, and about environmental action, I think today, begin at least with individuals. And we all know this, but sometimes we don't always talk about it explicitly. But people are always embedded in social and economic and political and technological contexts, and natural and cultural, et cetera, which strongly shape what we do, what we can do, what we actually do, and even what we want to do, right? Even what we think would be good to do. And in relationship to climate change and to environmental problems generally, there are these structures that we live in create a lot of incentives for bad behavior and obstacles to good behavior. And what I mean by this is basically, we live in worlds that for the most part make it really much more comfortable and convenient and often cheap to do things that are not as sustainable. And acting in ways that are more sustainable and more responsible are difficult and sometimes often more expensive. And this is because of the way environmental problems are constructed. They're constructed as externalities to the production process, right? So individuals rather than producers come to bear both the cost of addressing environmental problems to the extent that they are addressed, and also the brunt of the harms that are done. And so I think food production is a good example of this process of externalization. So factory farms, high intensity agriculture harms the air, the soil, the water, etc. And then citizens bear the cost in terms of health hazards and also increased taxes when we have to pay for this. And in a situation like this, focusing on individual change by, say, trying to persuade people to buy organic food, not that there's anything wrong with organic food, but it fails to address the larger problems created by a production process that passes both the environmental and the financial costs on to individuals and encourages us to think that those are actually the solutions, right? That the solutions lie in these individual choices. And I think this is really common sense. I don't think this is new and surprising to anyone, but I think it doesn't get built into the way we do ethics. We still are asking questions like, how can we apply principles like sustainability? And I realized the way the call for papers asked the question was ambiguous use of passive tense, which suggests that structures as well as individuals could be involved. So I'm not talking just about that. I think I'm just trying to, okay, let me, I've got more to say about individualization, but I want to talk a little bit about the problem of the linear relationship and make sure I finish up in 2 minutes. So I'll do that, and then maybe there'll be questions later where we can talk about that more. So in addition to individualizing the problem, most of the ways of thinking about this values practice gap rest on an understanding of human behavior that assumes that people act deliberately, that we develop intentions, and that we then act on those intentions, and that the consequences that occur are largely those that we intended. And I think that there's a whole series of overly optimistic assumptions here about how intentional people are in their behavior most of the time, about how much control we have over what we do and over the consequences of our actions. And this is really important for understanding climate change. And this is kind of the heart of the point I want to make, which is that when we focus on intentions, we miss most of the harm that we actually do. No one intended climate change to occur, even though it was obviously built by people and by human practices. And this is true of most environmental problems. And even though now we do know which actions are contributing to climate change, we still do them. And it's not our intention to make the problem worse, but we keep doing this. And the harm is done because of the nature of our actions and the structures that we live in, which make it impossible to avoid these consequences that we did not want. So Stephen Vogel is really good on this. His book, I highly recommend his book, Thinking Like a Mall. He says that what we should do is not necessarily to try to solve specific problems through individual actions, but try to build the sort of community that is capable of addressing these problems effectively, right? So think more about creating a system not in which individuals act differently, but in which we have a collective context in which we can all work differently together. And this community, just to sort of tie back to this originating question, the sort of community that we might build that would be capable of addressing climate change would be one that does embody and materialize those principles of sustainability and justice and responsibility. But of course, building this community is not so easy. It's not going to happen because we just tell people about, give people more information and try to change their minds. What we need to do then is create structures that do materialize those principles and give people incentives to act differently. And that means, I think, just to, sorry, I'm trying to wrap things up quickly. Thank you, Kelly, I saw your message. As an ethicist, I want to think that what are the roles that ethical ideas have in this kind of change? And I have 3 points here about ideas, and then I'll wrap up. That will be my wrapping up. First, I think we need to think about the kinds of ideas that matter. And one of the things that I've learned from the literature on conservation behavior is that the most effective and helpful kind of information is procedural. So not to try to persuade people to recycle, but rather to give them information that makes recycling easier and more convenient. And I wonder if this is a question I'm hoping that some of you have ideas about how we as ethicists and environmental thinkers can be helpful in providing procedural information of some sort. And so the second question then about how ideas matter is think about when and where they matter. And here I think there's a lot of evidence that ideas change most powerfully with generations, right? Rather than changing lots of individual minds, people affecting people, especially in school, in college, in high school, at transitional times of their lives. That's where people's ideas change. So I think here there is a really hopeful, possibility for us as ethicists and as educators to have an impact. And then the last thought I had was about thinking about whose ideas matter. And the ideas that matter are the ideas of people with power. And this goes back to the focus point about the kinds of communities that we want to create, and about maybe that we as ethicists need to think more explicitly in political terms, rather than think about the kind of polity we have, the kind of community, political community that we have, and how it can effectively address these questions. And these are things I'm really wrestling with. These are very unfinished, obviously very unfinished thoughts. But it's been really exciting to wrestle with these with my students this semester, and I'm really interested in any thoughts the rest of you have. Thank you.
Thanks so much. We have time maybe for maybe 1 or 2 questions. I think we have about maybe 2 minutes or so for questions. So if you'd like to put them in the chat, feel free, and I'll go ahead and read them. Okay, this is from Nishak. Can you elaborate on your first point about procedural information?
Yes, definitely. There's a book I've been one of the first book we taught in the classes. I don't know if you can see this, but it's backwards. Anyway, it's by Elizabeth de Sombra. It's called Why Good People Do Bad Environmental Things. And this is one of the things she really emphasizes, that information is effective when it helps people do things in a way that's convenient and comfortable and easy for them. So rather than trying to give people, oh yeah, I can share the title. Anyway, rather than using information to try to change people's minds about what they should do, the information that is the most effective in actually changing behavior is giving people information that tells them what to do, right? Like, okay, take your recycling out to the street on this day. That's a real simple explanation. She uses better examples, but I can't think of them right now. Does that help? Does that answer that a little bit?
Thank you. So I think we're going to suspend questions now. We're going to move on to our next speaker. And what we'll be doing is, if you do have questions that you can't get answered, if our speakers are willing, we'll actually go ahead and gather those in the chat, and we'll send them an email with all of your questions and contact information if they have a chance to answer them at a later date. All right. So Peter, if you'd like to unmute yourself and put up your slides. Our next speaker is Peter Abaloja from Namante Azikiwe University, Nigeria. And we're extremely happy to have him here. His talk is titled, "What are the relevant concepts and principles in the ethics of climate change? How can their practical impact be increased?" And Peter, go ahead and take it away. Thank you so much.
Relevant concept. My job is to talk about the relevant concepts and principles in the ethics of climate change and how they can practically be increased. Now, my goal, the goal of my paper is to create awareness especially in my country, where the issue of climate change in Nigeria, where the issue of climate change isn't taken so seriously because of the so many other economic problems that seems to occupy the front seat of major discussions. And so my job is to create awareness so policymakers and directors could take the issue of climate change more importantly, speaking from a Nigerian perspective, at the same time I'm trying to talk about it generally on a global perspective. And so when we talk about climate change, we're literally talking about observable patterns in change, observable patterns that change in the climate. And so when we talk about observable patterns, who is really observing this change in atmospheric conditions is actually man. Man is the one observing. And the next question is, if man is the one observing, what is really important? So what is it? Okay, it is important that man is observing because also man, by his actions, by his activities on the earth, he contributes to the problem, to the cause of the change in the climate. And so man is also a part of the problem. So ethics comes into the discussion of climate change to see a way, because ethics talks about the rightness and wrongness of human actions, how the actions of man could be regulated in such a way to minimize the resultant effect of harm, and then how man could possibly adapt on the planet, on Earth, by minimizing the effect of his actions and activities. And so basically when we talk about climate change, we're primarily talking about start with concepts, major concepts. What about harm? What about harm? Man living in the earth definitely will have to engage in different kinds of activities to make the earth adaptable for him. But as man does that, he's careful of the fact, he should be careful of the fact that there are risk, there are dangers by his actions. The desire of humanity is longevity. One major desire is longevity. So how can man be cautious enough in going about his different actions, living on the earth, adapt more to it, and minimize harm, prevent harm, whichever way possible. So we're talking about, next we're talking about the major ethical principles. Major ethical principles, talking about prevention of harm, talking about precautionary approach, talking about equity and justice, talking about sustainable development, talking about solidarity and scientific knowledge. We're also talking about integrity in decision making. And so I want to practically talk about prevention of harm. From the little clue I gave earlier, is that man does a lot of activities on the earth, industrial activities, refineries, mining, manufacturing, burning of fossil fuel and energy generation, and also as well as emission of greenhouse gases. So this is man's activity on the earth that brings about this harm. So the next question should be, how should these actions be regulated? The practical impact is to ensure that these regulations are not just theoretical. They are kind of a way enshrined into basic forms of learning, enshrined into educational curriculum of different levels of education, enshrined into the ideology of what the people should concern themselves in the now. So this regulation kind of, in a way, builds up a behavioral pattern whereby people know the risks that they stand, the risk that they stand to endanger themselves with by their actions. You understand? On our plane, industrialists, the person burning greenhouse gases at home, and all levels. So the regulations should go down into being enshrined into social institutions whereby people understand what is happening, especially where I come from, in Nigeria and Africa. People are concerned with the issues of their stomach, concerned how to make a living, how to survive, harsh economic situations. And so we have to find a way of putting it into our educational system. So, and bring about more regulations in behavioral patterns. And so next principle is precautionary approach. Precautionary approach, we talk about in the light of harm, to prevent harm, how actions in advance, precautionary approach, in advance, how can we talk to industrialists? How can we talk to ourselves as people, that our actions, we should be mindful, we should take actions in advance to prevent the harm that we may bring to ourselves, bring to the climate, ourselves, bring harm by endangering our lifespan. Human beings tend to live shorter these days, unlike in the earlier times. So more regulations ahead of industrial activities, ahead of all kinds of activities that result in the emissions of forms of carbons into the atmosphere. So next we'll talk about equity and justice. Most localities, there are localities who are mostly affected, by these industrial activities, mostly affected. Part of my country, part of a region called the Niger Delta, there's a lot of hazard that has taken place as a result of refinery activities. So there should be a way where policymakers should make efforts to ensure that such communities are provided with basic amenities to cushion the problem of health that may result, give them good education to increase their educational levels to where they can understand what is going on the climate, what is going on in the environment. So drinkable water. So next is continuity, sustainable development. Sustainable development definitely talks about continuity. How can the principle of sustainable development as an ethical principle comes into the issue of climate change? Successive governments needs to build upon action plans that have been generated, climate actions that have been generated by previous administrations, by previous governments. There have to be an intentional drive to ensure that different administrations, different governments, different policies take on this issue of climate change and how human behavior, human actions should be regulated, should be guided in such a way to reduce the harm caused to the environment. And nextly, we're talking about solidarity and scientific knowledge. Solidarity and scientific knowledge. We're talking about the fact that the issue of climate change is not particular to any region of the earth. It's everybody. Everybody's affected. Because I live in a developing country, because I come from the third world, we are all affected. We are children of Mother Earth. We are affected by this together. And so there should be more collaborative efforts. The way it could be practically increased. There should be more collaborative efforts among countries to fund scientific research, put reserve funds to fund scientific research, and also see to the fact that these findings are shared among countries, shared among communities, shared among different policy making agencies. And also then lastly, we're talking about integrity in decision making. We see, like I cited in my presentation, we see a situation whereby because different governments, different policymakers come and go, they want to fulfill their mission in terms of their particular policy they want for that administration. They tend to talk about the issue of climate change with bias. Talk about the issue of climate change with bias, as if it's one hoax, it's one over-exaggeration of but these are facts. This science deals with facts, and ethics comes into the discussion by leaders, make policy makers and directors understand that you just have to be humble. You just have to show willingness to accept the findings of science and see a way that you can walk around it and develop informed actions that bring about good climate actions that will bring up climate actions that will reduce the changes that take place in the climate. And so that is basically my presentation. I don't know if I hit the mark of 8 minutes or more than. Thank you very much.
You're about perfect. So we have about maybe 4.5 minutes for questions. If you'd like to stick them in the chat, I'll go ahead and read them off. I have a question while we're waiting for other people to put their questions in the chat. You talked a good bit about the precautionary principle, and I'm just curious, with climate change advancing so quickly, with all the studies coming out, how do you see the precautionary principle as kind of informing what we're doing now to help future climate change, where it's hard to, we're already quite far down the path of really changing the climate kind of forever?
Okay, thank you for that question. What we're doing right now, it creates sensitize more people. You're going to make this recordings available. It's going to go on a lot of platforms to sensitize people, sensitize policymakers, sensitize policy directors on the very fact that if we have not been taking this issue of climate change serious before, or we've been treating it with some form of bias, we really need to put our hands on this and take concrete actions, find it into a way into our policies, institutionalize climate actions, institutionalize climate actions so that everybody understands that this is, to shock you, to say plainly, most people are not, they're oblivious when it comes to climate change. Oblivious, especially in developing countries, they're oblivious. They only see the effects in terms of excessive heat. They don't know what's the cause. They see the effect of a distortion in weather patterns. They don't know the reason. But there's something going on because they are not aware of. They are not properly being sensitized. In my paper, I talked about how there's a practical distortion in our weather patterns. It is so bad that in times where there ought to be cold weathers, you see extreme heat. In times where there ought to be rain, you see drought. People are, and there's a way it also affects human behavior. And that's something else. It's another paper I'm trying to bring up, where how climate change affects human behavior in terms of even bad actions, even right actions. I'm talking about social crimes. There's a way, because psychologically, it affects, and it has a more ripple effect. It goes down into agricultural aspect, whereby in my country, the local farmers observe weather patterns, and the changes there, they cannot go into good farming. And you can't go into good farming, you can't go into predictable farming, mechanized farming, because you are seeing something in the weather that you don't understand. And before you know, food shortage come. And we start facing a more prolonged problem of being able to feed ourselves. And so this, in the aspect of precautionary approach, this symposium is a sensitization tool to advise policymakers and policy directors to be more intentional about the issue of climate change. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. This is from Lenovo. As the main reasons for the climate change problem, what kind of ethical approach should humans adopt to tackle climate change?
Come again, please.
Sorry. What kind of ethical approach should humans adopt to tackle climate change, given the current problem we have?
The current problem we have, we have to be more intentional, more intentional, more intentional. Because all the stuff we're doing right now, all this sensitization tools, seminars, and all this is a means to influence those in government, because those in power, those in government, those who control the institutions of society, this is a means to influence them, to convince them that intentional actions in the forms of laws should be put in place to regulate. Regulation is in my interest, to regulate industrial activities, regulate. There's a concept that been coming to my mind. I'm still doing some research about it. Confinement population. Confinement population. For you see what happened in the pandemic era, where people on lockdown, industrial activities reduced, a lot of movement reduced, in terms of vehicular movement reduced. So one of the principles I think ethically that should be put to in terms of precaution is to intentionally regulate human activities, put laws in place, regulate human activities. There's nothing bad to say maybe once in every 4 months of the year, we should reduce our vehicular movements. We should reduce our industrial activities in terms of one of fossil fuel and giving more to renewable energy. And so that's how I.
Thank you. And we did have one more question we don't have time to answer right now, but we're going to, if you could say that till maybe the end of this session, where we'll have a or a full discussion. So our third speaker, Anthony Voissard, if you'd like to go ahead and, if you're using slides, go ahead and unmute yourself and load those. So Dr. Voissard is from the University of Quebec in Abitibi, Témiscamingue, Canada. And his title is Ethics in IPCC. Where are we now?
Thank you, Kelly. So I will try to be as brief as possible. I know that we have only 10 minutes to start. So yes, this talk is called Ethics in IPCC. Where are we now? So I'm trying to put it full screen. Okay, good. So in this talk, what I'm trying to do, actually I aim to do is to produce a critical synthesis of the IPCC's ethical perspective in the RR5 as well as in AR6. So in this talk, I will talk more about my result of this critical synthesis in the AR5, since the full cycle of publication of the AR6 is not finished yet. So basically, why I aim to do this critical analysis is to see what means ethics in the work of the IPCC. So the two main research questions are: what does the concept ethics mean in the work of the IPCC? That's the question that I will be more talking about today. So that's the descriptive side of the research project. But another important question in this research project is what are the strengths and limits of the key meanings associated with ethics in these reports. So a bit about the analysis method. So this method is framed under a hermeneutical framework or an interpretative framework. So when we look on the meaning of ethics in the body of the text, we did that, but we also consider other words in the text of the IPCC that refer to different conception of ethics, such as equity, equality, justice, and so on. But also in the full reports, like the full IPCC reports are basically 2,000 pages reports. So it means that by each working group we have 2,000 pages. So it's really important as work. So we also look at the ethical values stated explicitly or implicitly in these reports. So you can see here the result from the working group 3 and working group 2 reports. So you can see the distribution of the occurrences of the word ethics and its declination in the body of the IPCC working group 3 and 2 in the AR5. So you can see maybe just a comment here. In the climate ethics literature, when we refer to the ethics, the so-called ethics chapter in the IPCC, we refer to the 3rd chapter of the working group 3 in the AR5, which is called Social, Economic, and Ethical Concepts and Methods. So that's the one chapter that John Broome and Lucas Meyer contributed to. But one thing that is really interesting to point out is that it is not only in this chapter that ethics is discussed in the IPCC's reports, as you can see. So we discuss mainly ethics in this chapter, and I will talk about what mean ethics in this chapter. But you can see also that ethics is discussed as a point of view in sustainable development and equity, as well as a point of view in decision making in ethics about adaptation to climate change. So I think it's interesting to point out. So we identify actually 5 key meanings of ethics in these recent reports. So I can discuss a bit about those meaning. Can you still see my slide?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. So the predominant ethical conception of these reports refer to a relatively narrow view of philosophical ethics. These developments are mainly presented in the 3rd chapter of the AR5 3rd Working Group report. Within this framework, the ethical discussion is divided into 2 main constituent branches, namely the theory of justice and the theory of value. This ethical standpoint can be criticized for marginalizing the contribution of a plurality of possible development in philosophical ethics, such as applied ethics, care ethics, ecofeminism, etc. These reports also focus on the ethical discussion from the point of view of responsible decision-making. This is specifically addressed in the report of the 2nd working group. In this case, ethics is an integral component of decision-making in climate change adaptation. Ethics is then integrated into various cross-cutting dimensions and several complementary disciplines. Ethical decision-making is understood in a situationist and pluralist perspective. This is because climate change adaptation options cannot themselves be fully evaluated out of context and without considering the diversity of interests, objectives, and values of the participant in the decision-making processes. Within IPCC's reports, ethical discourse can also be interpreted according to a transversal perspective of climate equity. a number of justice principles and frameworks for equitable burden sharing are emphasized, including the principle of distributive equity as well as the principle of procedural equity. According to a Ford point of view, ethical reflection can be integrated into the discussion on opportunities, constraints, and limits of climate adaptation. Finally, in the IPCC's reports, including the AR6 report, so the new reports on the basis of climate science, and this is new, ethics also constitute a discourse on value judgment in relation to climate change. The transparency of ethical value judgments is emphasized, as well as the complex interrelationship that is specific, that this specific type of judgment can have within climate policy, but also climate science. The IPCCs now recognize that climate science and climate policy issues are not just about factual judgment, they include normative component. So that's something that I wanted to point out here. And in conclusion, we can ask ourselves what are the ethical blind spots in those climate science reports, and I find that for now the blind spots are located in climate adaptation and climate science reports. Although some work are done on this part. So on the one hand, we suggest that more space be given to ethical and normative issue in the reports of the first and second working groups. These type of issues could be dealt with at least as much as in the report of the third working group. So the third working group is about mitigation of climate change. The second working group is about adaptation, and the first working group is about the climate science basis. On the other hand, we suggest that the ethical discussion be integrated into the various topics discussed throughout the chapters of the full reports, akin to what is already done for the issue of equity in the report of the third working group. So I think we can argue that an increased focus on ethical reflection will provide additional insight into the work of the IPCC, which could be beneficial in order to better equip the world political decision makers. Yeah. So I think that's it for the talk. So thank you for your attention, and now let's discuss.
Sounds good. If you'd like to put your questions in the chat, that would be great. We have about 4.5 minutes till we move to the general discussion. So this is a question from Jen Milic. Great insights. Did you identify the use of ethics as a meaningless placeholder for all kinds of normative issues?
I'm not sure to understand the question. What do you mean?
Jen, if you want to put more information in the chat, feel free. I think it might be as kind of, if you've heard the term ethics washing, or it might be kind of putting in ethics and not really explaining what it means.
Okay, I see. Yeah. Okay. Well, at least in the last report, not on the, I'm not talking about here about the AR6, but I'm talking about the AR5. Some insight that are very interesting and that are coming from John Broome, who worked on the famous and so-called chapter on ethics, is that actually ethics and justice were pretty controversial. So at one point in the SPM, so on the summary for policymaker, ethic was being injustice issues. The people, so official, wanted justice to not appear in the summary for policymakers. So in the full report, scientists and social scientists, and as well as philosophers, may have more room to discuss justice issue and ethics. But from my point of view, I don't see this kind of ethics washing in the reports. So I think it's not the intention.
Thank you. We had another message from Sophia. Quantitative versus quality. What is more relevant in these reports?
Well, we can say that both are relevant, but the thing is that when you look at those really enormous reports, like those 2,000 pages reports that not many people read, actually, you can ask yourself if the discussion on ethics could have more room. And I think it has been discussed in the literature and by authors that actually contributed in the IPCC reports.
Thank you. And then we have a message from, or a question from another person. Thank you for your brief sketch on ethics. What is the difference between ethics as a philosophical standpoint and as a discourse on value judgment?
Actually, when ethics is discussed in the third chapter, they divide it in two branches, in theory of justice and in value theory. So that's another framework to put it. But when maybe I didn't say it, but all the categories that I talk about may have some relationship with each other. So the category are not totally fixed and separated. So they may have some connection. Actually, when John Broome is discussing value theory in this third chapter, he talks about also value judgment. So that's a nice connection. But when they discuss in the preface of the third working group, when they discuss about value judgment, they do not frame it as a value theory. So that's another way to frame it.
Thank you. And I think from here, we're going to open up the discussion to all three speakers. So Anna, Peter, if you'd like to turn on your microphones and your video, we'll go ahead. I have two questions already. Thank you, Andrew, for being patient. So what I'll do is I have two questions now, and then if you want to raise your hand and if you want to speak directly to the speakers, or if you'd like to put it in the chat, I'll keep track and we'll see how many questions we can get through until our break. So the first question I have is, and I'll put it in the chat 1 second, is in relationship to the first talk, does the ethics thinking in the IPCC acknowledge that climate change is not intended? Or is there some discussion in the document about handling this lack of intention? I think this is for you, Anthony.
Oh, this is for me? Mm-hmm. Okay, sorry, I was reading another question. Can you repeat this one?
Sure. In relationship to the first talk of Anna's, does the ethics thinking in the IPCC acknowledge that climate change is not intended? Or is there some discussion in the document about handling this lack of intention?
That's a really good question. So about that, I will have to um, I, so I wouldn't right now. I wouldn't risk to answer the question in the sense that I will have to look back to the text, but yeah, that's a really good question.
Okay. What I'll do is I'll send all the questions we get to the speakers, and maybe you can respond via email once you've had a chance to reflect. Okay. So the next question we have is from Elizabeth. The first two speakers both stress the role of policymakers and governments. What can individuals do? And this is for all the speakers, whoever would like to answer.
I guess I would just say, yeah, go ahead, Peter.
Okay, what could individuals do? This time we're not talking about government institutions, we're talking about individuals. What can individuals do? Individuals to live. I'm a philosopher, so I want to speak like a philosopher. To live. Living is an act, is a function of the soul. And for you to live a healthy life, you need to understand that your actions matters. Your action could risk you to live a healthy life, or your actions could help you to live an abundant life, a more fruitful life with longevity. So when you understand this fact as an individual, and the issue of climate change comes into discussion, you need to intentionally make intentional actions to reduce your harm to the environment, your harm to the climate, in terms of reducing, cutting short of climate greenhouse emission of greenhouse gases. You reduce the amount of fossil fuel you burn. You reduce it. You intentionally, you make effort to reduce it. I know these are really tough things, but individually, we need to condition our mindset, make people believe that this it's not just all about a lofty talk that concerns the government and policymakers. No, it also concerns you as an individual. The action of one person matters. The action of one person matters. And so I think that I should stop there.
Anna, did you want to add to that?
I would just say I think it's always got to be both and, right? Structures and individuals. And that begins with also realizing that structures are created by individuals, by individual practices, right? And so we don't want to reify institutions or structures or policy as something that exists somehow apart from individual decisions and actions and, unintentional actions. So I think that is not really an answer to the question of what can individuals do, but certainly I would say in emphasizing structures, that doesn't mean to leave individuals out. I'm not sure, Elizabeth, if that is really much of an answer to your question. I mean, I think, in practical terms, there's tons of things that individuals can do, both in terms, I worry about individual consumption, focus on individual consumption choices. But I think there are a lot of reasons that those are important. And I think this relates to what Peter was saying, as examples, as there are multiplier effects, so that the effect of someone taking principled actions or trying to live in a more just or sustainable or responsible way can have an impact that is greater than just the reduction in resources consumed.
Thank you. And this is a message from Claudio. Oh, I'm sorry. Or for Anthony. Do you think to measure the relative importance of ethics compared to other meaningful words within the report, e.g. science, policy, or risk?
Yes, actually, I did at the beginning of the analysis. For example, the term economic, like the expression economic or economy, were cited pretty often in comparison of the term ethics, for example. And I would also say that the term ethics was pretty marginal in comparison of other term in the full reports. So let's say that those reports talk about a lot of subject, and the topic of ethics is not the main subject. And yeah, that would be my answer for now.
I have
And maybe
sorry,
maybe something to add about this. And I didn't talk much about this in this talk, but I also look or measure the relative importance of other terms surrounding ethics, such as justice, equity, decision making, philosophy, etc., to see in comparison what is the importance of ethics.
Thank you. And then just a couple comments. We had one for Elizabeth's question. One set of answers about the effective individual actions is here, and she gives a link to IOP Science. It is controversial, especially with respect to procreation, but is good to start in terms of being effective in reducing emissions. And another comment we got, a possible response to the question about intentions. Peter Singer dealt with the question of intentions and how long the not knowing better argument holds. I think this is close to the question about intentions. His response in a nutshell is that it does not hold from 1990 onwards, as everyone could have known by then and thus should be held accountable for their actions. And we have one more question from Andrew Jimton, and this is for Anna. I'm old enough to remember consciousness raising. Are some of the principles of consciousness raising useful in helping unintended results become more manageable by intended actions?
Wow. Just real quick on the Peter Singer quote, I think that I absolutely agree that not knowing better is not an excuse, but I also do think that intentions and knowledge are different, so that we can act without an intention to do something while also still knowing it's happening, if that makes sense. So consciousness raising, this is a super interesting question. And I think it relates a little bit to the question from Crystal about how marginal ideas can penetrate through current power structures. And just real quick, my, and another hat that I wear is studying religion and social change, particularly in the Americas and in Latin America. And so there are lots of really great examples of the ways that particular kinds of communities and community practices engaging in what in Spanish is called concientización, so consciousness raising, was very helpful, both in helping people see connections between sources and causes of problems, their own actions, consequences, and thinking about effective ways to address those. And also, I think in giving people, sort of collectivizing some of this thinking, which I think is the key to making it possible for marginalized ideas to have a greater impact, is by creating collective structures that give people a voice.
Thank you. We have about maybe a minute and a half, 2 minutes. Any final questions for this session? If not, we're going to take probably a 5 to 6 minute break. If you could be back here by 10:15, we will have our first invited speaker, Stephen Gardner. So thank you so much, and we'll keep the recording on, but we'll see you in about 5. Thank you so much.